I contemplated whether it was even worth doing this, to be honest with you. I thought, is there any point? It's a posthumous album. What can we really even say here? But it really annoyed me more than it should have, listening to this album, because there's so many elements to it that I just had to get off my chest, because this all just feels so off to me. And I'm surprised I'm not seeing that many people push back on this release, and it just seems to be sort of a given and mostly accepted, when most of the time posthumous releases are widely regarded as, let's not do this. But it seems as though Sophie's sort of not had that same response here with this album. The general excuse I'm seeing made for this one particularly is that it was nearly finished before it came out. So in regards to your standard posthumous album, this one gets a pass in that sense. And I've got to say, before I even get into the review, I may as well just do a little bit of a rant here about how I just still don't think that's an acceptable reason for an album to be coming out. If it's nearly finished, that isn't the same as being finished. I mean, why is that okay for an album to be coming out when the artists themselves haven't even had a say in like a portion of the album? And what is nearly finished? Is that 60%? Is that 70%? Is that 80%? What percentage are you going to slap on it? Who knows? But still, nearly is not good enough for me when it comes to releasing music. She still didn't get a say in a portion of this album, which she may have changed her mind on and said, no, you know what, I want to do it this way, I want to do it that way. I don't know if I want this song here. I might want to chop and change this. It wasn't given to her because obviously she tragically passed away. I can't make excuses. If you speak to anybody in the music industry, and that I mean anybody when I say that, like it could be a DIY making music in their bedroom, or somebody that's on a grander scale that might be more of a mainstream recognizable name in the music industry, it doesn't really matter how big or small they are. You often do have conversations with these people, and they will say things like when they're in the midst of making an album, they'll have all this material created, they'll have all these songs out that they are happy with, and then maybe out of nowhere they suddenly decide that they don't like this song, they don't like the placement of this thing, they suddenly don't really want this song to be on this album, they save it for something else, they scrap things entirely and it just never sees the light of day, or it's saved for perhaps a deluxe edition, that kind of thing. Like, this isn't stuff that I'm an expert with. Like, I'm not trying to talk down on people here. I'm no expert when it comes to creating albums or anything like that, but I've spoken to people who have. And that's a very common thing you hear. The amount of artists that will just have something that they're sat on for ages that they won't put out. And that, to me, adds to the fact that this album not being quite finished or whatever is not great, because perhaps Sophie could have sat down and been like, you know what, not too keen on this anymore. I want to change this. I want to chop and change these tracks. I want to do something different here. And that opportunity was taken away. Through nobody's fault, of course, but that's why these albums shouldn't see the light of day. This is why these albums shouldn't come out, because these artists don't get to have those last minute changes, those last minute change of hearts, those last minute decisions, those extra details that nobody else would think of because they are that artist. Nobody else is that person. You just can't justify this, really. And look, this whole video could just be a video about posthumous albums, but I don't want to do that. Let's talk about the actual music itself, despite all those things that are weighing this album down. And, you know, fixate on the actual material that we do get. And yeah, it doesn't really sound good to me. Like, even if this was a natural progression for Sophie, which in some places doesn't really sound like that, actually. I've seen some people say that based on, like, you know, remixes and DJ sets and stuff like that, like this was where Sophie was heading. Perhaps it was, but even still, I don't think it sounds good. Like, I'm still not really keen on the way some of these tracks sound and some of these features are added into the album and the way some of the beats sound. But particularly I want to focus on the beats, because that's, to me, is where like the soul of Sophie seems missing, because some of these tracks just don't sound like the heavy load of detail that you usually get from Sophie production. Like, I don't know if Sophie would have put out songs like this without that extra flair, without that extra dynamic, like animated feel that you got on Oils or you got on Products. Like it just isn't really there in these beats. I mean, is Sophie really making a beat like Raw and just leaving it at that? It honestly sounds like somebody parodying the sound of Sophie, like just making a really obnoxious sounding beat and calling it a day without adding anything else to it. And yeah, sure, some people may not be a fan of what Sophie was doing anyway, and they might describe Sophie's music as obnoxious, but there was always something else added. Like, it always felt like there was purpose to what Sophie was doing. This beat just sounds really, really ugly to me, and that feature is just not adding great things to the song either. Plunging Asymptote, again, to me sounds like somebody who doesn't really quite get what Sophie's trying to do, makes a Sophie song and just calls it there and says this is what all Sophie songs sound like, because it's got this repetitive, ugly refrain that is just constantly being repeated and constantly being jammed in your head. And again, I think if you were to hear a Sophie song and it fell on the wrong kind of crowd, you maybe think that all her songs sounded like this, but there is again more to it, and there was more flair there without it just being this really annoying refrain that Sophie is not signing off on this, man. I just find it so hard to believe. And look, I'm not trying to accuse anybody of anything. I'm not doing that kind of thing, but it's so hard to believe that Sophie would hear this herself and go, yeah, this is what I want on my album. Like, what world? I can't comprehend hearing Plunging Asymptote and thinking that's something Sophie crafted and called it there. Like, I just don't believe it. And look, I could be wrong, and we'll never know. And perhaps that is what Sophie wanted from this particular song. Maybe. I could be wrong. I could be right, and we'll still never know either. The problem is that we'll never know, and there shouldn't be that aura of doubt or that air of doubt being attached to it. Like, it should just be you're listening to this and the artist is giving you their fully realized vision. Like, there shouldn't be, and that's the whole point, that's the whole existence of this album that just irks me, because it's like we just don't know. And reason why with the features I don't really feel that keen on. I find that kind of like refrain, like sort of like it's like a chopped sample or something in the background, like reason why, a little bit irritating. I don't know, the way this album runs to me just feels at times like it's trying a bit too hard to just kind of like latch on to things that might stick in your head, but none of it really sounds that enjoyable. It just sounds a bit irritating. Why Lies to me just sounds like, you know, those like Radio 1 DJ mix sets that play on like Saturday nights. I assume because Radio 1 isn't being listened to by that many people on a Saturday night, so they're just shoving these kind of random DJ mixes and stuff. This track just sounds like a generic takeoff from that to me. It doesn't sound like it's got any personality to it whatsoever. And this is the thing, like, look, even to me, I could say this doesn't sound like a Sophie song at all, because it just doesn't. But even without that critique, I just still don't think it sounds that good. Like, there's very little to latch onto here. Like, it isn't an enjoyable moment on the album. And to be fair, saying it doesn't sound like a Sophie song is a valid thing to say anyway. Like, I'm going to a Sophie album because I want to hear stuff that sounds like Sophie. I know, shock, right? Shock horror. He wants to hear music that sounds like the artist that has released the album. I know, what a shocker. That's a valid critique in itself anyway. But it still sounds not very good. I'm sorry. I've talked a little bit as well about how some of these instrumentals just don't sound cooked up at all. Like, they sound bare to the bones, barely anything being added on top of it, without that sort of Sophie flair that brings it all together. But do you want to be alive? I'm sorry, man, but this really does sound like somebody was just on the computer finding files and just clicked on anything and thought, oh, well, Sophie made this, so let's just insert it into the album. Again, not accusing anybody of anything, because I don't want to be doing that, but I'm just saying, it really sounds like that. Like, this doesn't sound like a finished product of a song. It sounds so uncooked, so bare to the bones, like literally a generic preset that you take from Ableton or something. So it's not all bad, it's just very much mostly really bad. Like I just can't get over how bad some of these songs sound, really. It's quite shocking to me. And yeah, just everything about it feels wrong. It just feels like it isn't natural, or it doesn't feel like everything sticks in the way it's meant to. Something about this album just feels off. Some of it feels unfinished. Some of it doesn't feel like I'd expect Sophie to sign off and go, yeah, I'm okay with this. Like, so much of it just feels wrong. Yeah, as you can tell, I'm not really a fan of this album, and the fact that it exists to begin with doesn't really sit right with me. I just wish everyone made a tattoo on their body like Anderson .Paak did and said, look, you are not touching anything I made once I die. Like, I don't care when I die, how old I am, or what access you have, you are not putting anything out there. And I think everyone in the music industry should really just do that, because at the end of the day, even if this was nearly finished, Sophie didn't get the final say on whether she wanted this to come out. Like, that is the bottom line. She didn't get to say whether this comes out, and that should be the end of the argument, really. But still, like, nearly finished. And what, she died in January 2021. Towards the end of 2024, it's only just coming out. Like, how nearly finished was this, really? Could this not have come out at least a year ago, if we're being honest? Like, that is a long time for an album to not come out when it's nearly finished. So I'm just skeptical of a lot of this material. I don't know who was behind the scenes working on this or doing things or whatever, but it just doesn't feel like Sophie would release a bulk of this. Even if this was a direction she was heading in, which I'm not doubting, I still just don't think these songs, the way they sound, are exactly what we would expect from Sophie. And even without all of that, just listening to it as an album without thinking about that stuff, I still didn't enjoy it anyway. 4 out of 10, and honestly that might be generous, because I'm trying to take my own biases away from this album in that sense. I'm trying not to think too hard about it and just think for what it is, the music that we got. And yeah, 4 out of 10, but I could go lower, honestly, I really could. But that's it from me. I don't want to keep talking about this album. I feel like I've made my point quite loud and clear. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you agree with me, disagree with me? Do you think I'm being too harsh? Do you think there's some quality here that I've not quite realised, I've not quite thought about or considered? Let me know. Would love to see your thoughts. Let's keep it civil in the comments, so let's be fair here. Have a good day. Subscribe as well if you haven't already. Would love to see more people in the comments in these videos. And goodbye.